Imagine living your life after 50 and feeling energized and excited about your future. Welcome to the Women in the Middle podcast, the podcast for women who are ready to figure out what they want and create the life they deserve. Here's your host and master certified life coach, Susie Rosenstein.
Hey there, today's episode is all about infidelity and midlife relationships with Dr. Lauren Napolitano. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast Women in the Middle with over 1 million downloads and counting. I'm your host, Susie Rosenstein, your master certified coach and midlife clarity expert, and I am so glad to be here with you again. So, I joked with my guest today that our interview was going to be interesting because as a podcast host, I'm known for my upbeat nature dealing with challenging and difficult midlife issues. And today's topic would no doubt be one of those challenging, difficult issues. And this topic, of course, can feel really heavy. But I know you're going to appreciate the perspective and insight that she brings to this whole topic. Now, just quick before we dive in, I'm also excited to invite you to download something I made for you that is free and fun to think about. It's your copy of Top 10 Tips to Reimagine Your Life After 50. It's super useful when you're looking for some journal prompts to start thinking about who you are, what you want, and what is really possible. If you're interested in grabbing this guide, head over to www.susierosenstein.com/10 questions. And it's the number 10. 10 questions. Okay, now here we go. As I mentioned, today's episode is all about infidelity and midlife relationships. My guest is Dr. Lauren Napolitano. Lauren is a clinical psychologist in Philadelphia. She has 25 years experience treating individuals and couples. She specializes in helping couples who are dealing with infidelity, sexual difficulties, and communication issues. She also works with divorced couples who need support in their co-parenting relationship. When she works with clients on an individual basis, she aims to help them get unstuck and better identify goals for themselves. She is direct, honest, and wants to help people to feel better fast. When Lauren is not working, she can be found walking her dog, watching The Real Housewives, or eating pizza. I really loved the opportunity to explore this topic with her, and I know you're going to get a lot out of hearing this interview. Here we go. Hi, Lauren. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Women in the Middle podcast.
Hi, Susie. Thanks for having me.
Wow. As we were talking just now a little bit in our pre-interview conversation, we realized together that it's kind of surprising that after having a podcast this long, this podcast started in 2017, that I haven't yet featured any expert on infidelity. And I know you were a little surprised. And as we're talking about it, I was a little surprised too. We've talked about marriage. We've talked about long-term relationships and divorce and when a spouse dies, but we haven't really talked about this. So I'm so grateful that you're here to talk about it because it's definitely a topic that is very hard to talk about. So I thought we could get started. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became an expert in this area.
Sure thing. I'm a clinical psychologist in Philadelphia. I work with individuals and couples, and I personally experienced infidelity in my first marriage about 15 years ago. I didn't specialize in infidelity when it was happening to me. Obviously, that would have been a little bit overwhelming.
Just
now that I think after about 10 years had passed, it really became something that I was passionate about because I had experienced it and I knew that it was a real catalyst for marriages.
Definitely. And so what were your main interests before that? Because I'm always looking for clues about passion, and my background is applied social psychology. So I know you've probably always been interested in behavior change, but what was it like for you when you were figuring out what you wanted to do?
I think within the realm of psychology, people follow like their own life history, like with a kick, like with a delay. So what happened to me is very similar to what happens to a lot of therapists, where when you first start out, you specialize in adolescence, because you're in your early 20s. So you really relate to the teenagers. And then once you phase out of that, you start specializing in postpartum care. And then you phase into something else. But I think it follows the sequence of what you've experienced, but with a delay.
That makes sense. So when it comes to infidelity, I know that you say it's common. Tell us a little bit about what's going on at a high level with infidelity and marriages, long-term relationships.
Well, the truth of the matter is it's obviously something that's very hard to get data on because there is such stigma and shame around it. So I can really only speak anecdotally, but I would say about a third of my couples cases present for couples therapy due to an infidelity, whether it's emotional infidelity or sexual infidelity, but there's some sort of rupture in the marriage that has occurred.
And so people are coming to you because of this?
Correct.
So they specifically, it's like maybe things were a little wonky before, but this was the thing that broke the camel's back and they need to come get help. Is that how it goes?
Yeah, I think really what it is for most people in really a very good way is that it's a big wake up call. It's like this giant light comes on. It's like, wow, okay, we were both potentially on autopilot for a while and, we have skidded off the road. And it's time to reassess and figure out like where are we going and what is working and what isn't working.
Wow, wake up calls are such a big part of midlife.
Yeah,
Yeah, totally. And I've done episodes on it. Like sometimes it's a health scare or something happens with your parents, your aging parents, where they get a diagnosis or you need to completely change the way you're living. Sometimes it's something with a kid or a job layoff or something. And infidelity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Okay. So tell us what happened, in your experience with your first marriage.
Well, I was married for about 8 years. I will say, in full disclosure, I had barely dated prior to getting married. I just had this rom-com illusion that you meet the one, right? Like bada bing, bada boom, everything's going to work out. And then you just live your married life. I will say in hindsight, I was very emotionally immature. So I got married and the marriage it didn't work. It just was very onerous. It was very hard. We were not in sync. I would argue this person wasn't consistently very kind to me. But I had this rom-com notion of like, you don't give up. You just keep trying and trying and trying and trying. And it must be me and I must do something different. And I got to dig deeper and I got to go to a different therapist and whatever. I just kept trying to push this sled up a hill. And then when I realized, via God, like blessed Apple phones, I saw the paper trail that my husband at the time was cheating. It gave me this, I will say I was traumatized at the time, but it also gave me this epiphany of like, you don't have to do this, like not every relationship is worth fighting for. So in a lot of ways, it gave me permission to leave. Whereas I think without that evidence, I might still be married and just trying and trying and trying, like beating my head against a wall with something that didn't work.
That's really interesting. I have also felt I got laid off from a long-term job, 19 years. And I often feel that if I didn't get laid off, if I didn't have that wake-up call, that thing that happened that was not in my control, I don't know if I would have had the nerve, the insight, the courage, whatever it was, to move on.
Yeah, right.
You're right. Like it's an outside thing that puts a spotlight on what's happening, and then it gives you more data. And that's always a great way to find more thoughts when you have more data.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, more possibility.
Yeah, for me, it gave me like a tangible evidence of like, I'd had this gut feeling that we were sliding or sort of circling the drain, but I didn't really have this evidence of like, you don't need to be here. You know what I mean? Like that this thing is broken and it's okay to walk away, which I think for a lot of people, it can be helpful.
Really helpful. And sometimes when if you're talking to a girlfriend or somebody that really loves you and has your best interests at heart, they may have some insight. But when you're experiencing it because of all these other thoughts and feelings you have from rom-coms, from your parents, from your grandparents, from society, from your friends, sometimes you just really don't have the perspective and you are only looking at it as one way, one path.
I think the other thing that happens too is that I can speak from personal experience is that when you're in a marriage that is in fact circling the drain, right? Like it's just going poorly. Every interaction is hostile or toxic or disappointing, just, for years and years. It's not something you even tell people. So I didn't tell my parents that things weren't going well. I didn't tell my friends. Like it was this very dark secret. So when I said we're getting divorced, people were blown out, right? Because we had been acting happy. But it's one of those things that even when your marriage isn't going well, it's so shameful that you don't even get the support or the feedback you need.
Why do you think there is so much shame and stigma around it?
Around like your marriage not doing well?
Yeah.
You know what I think it is, which is a very simplistic solution, is that, when you're like a little kid, say you're like in 7th or 8th grade, and your best friend Amanda is kind of excluding you from her birthday party or, like meeting with everybody in the bathroom stall, but locking you out. And you go home and you tell your mom, oh, Amanda is having a sleepover and she didn't invite me. Your mom never forgets that, right? Your mom now has an axe to grind with Amanda.
100%.
The next 25 years, that mom resents and is always distrustful of Amanda. Even when Amanda has earned her way back into your heart, your mom never forgives her. And I think we have that same logic when thinking about our spouses, which is just sort of like, if I really tell you how this person is treating me in my situation, right? Like where someone was being unkind to me, if you really knew how bad it was, there is no possibility of a comeback, right? Like the public perception will shift. My friends will be against him. And I'm hoping that this next couples therapist is going to inject us with some kind of love serum, and that hopefully I won't need anyone to know that we had this rough chapter. So I think it comes from, the way your mom treats your friend that was mean girling you, but also it comes from a sense of optimism, which is sort of like, hopefully we will leapfrog over this chapter and nobody needs to know.
Lauren, that is such a great description. And now you can really see that optimism coming through. And when you first think about stigma, it doesn't feel optimistic at all. It just feels dark. But yeah, we are internal optimists when it comes to love.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So in your notes, you mentioned that American culture has a cheaters always cheat kind of mentality. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that it's very true. And Esther Perel, who wrote an entire book on sort of cheating, extramarital affairs, et cetera, and she's not American, but she really hammers home this point that in Europe, there's much more tolerance for extramarital affairs. And in America, it's very black and white. If you tell someone, oh, my spouse cheated on me or I cheated, right? There is this knee-jerk cultural reaction of like, well, then it's over. Case closed, it's over, move on, pack your stuff, either free that person up to live their life or, throw that person out into the street. And it's true, that is our knee-jerk reaction. There's like very little patience or tolerance for the idea of like, well, maybe there's a little bit of a mess right now, but probably can be worked through. But I think it also contributes to why people don't tell their friends, right? Because they know they'll be bombarded with, okay, well, you need to leave.
Wow. And I guess the other thing you mentioned in your note here is that being in your 50s or older, it has this extra weight to it when it comes to starting over. Because now at this point of our lives, we're thinking much more about age and what that means for us. And even understanding what that means for us is very murky. A lot of the episodes on this podcast, we're looking at different ways to think about age and just noticing how negative we are about what's possible when you're reimagining possibility. So how does that come up in your practice? Have you noticed that a lot with women in their 50s?
I definitely think age and comfort and security and sort of long-term planning is one of the factors in terms of figuring out what the next steps are, right? I mean, When I got divorced, I was 35 and it was messy because I had little kids, which is a mess. But I didn't have that weight of like, wow, like I wanted to retire at this age and how does this affect things? It was more just kind of messy, but it didn't have that kind of long-term planning piece. But I definitely think for people that are midlife, there is a question of like, how much do I rock the boat?
Hmm. Yeah, I can see that also because it's so stressful too. And I didn't want to believe that if you leave a marriage, that there's still like it was in the 50s, kind of with all this social isolation. But there's a lot of stigma with being divorced. I was so surprised for people to tell me this. But especially for women in the middle, it really can be seen as very negative. You can be socially isolated.
Well, you definitely need to kind of renegotiate your friend group and kind of like find a new spot for sure. But I think on the flip side, like on the one hand, there is this heaviness of like, wow, like what is my next chapter? What does this affect my retirement? Like what is it going to look like with the kids? All of these sort of long-term factors. But the flip side of it is that in some ways, it's also kind of liberating. Like if you decide, like say in my marriage, where it's like, wow, this is the wake up call I needed. I can't do this for the next 30 years. There is something really invigorating about saying, you know what, life is short. Like, I don't know what's coming next, but I know I'm not going to do this, which I think is the liberation of midlife, where you know yourself and you know what you can and can't tolerate.
Yes. And we also are very aware of wasting time.
Absolutely.
Right? The whole wasting valuable time thing, it's very heavy. And there's a lot of awareness about that for sure. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you find out about an infidelity. How do people usually find out these days? Is it the phone?
It's always the phone. Right? What else could it be, Susie? It's always the phone, right? Whether it's like banking transactions or texting, or a lot of people use WhatsApp to try to not be using their texting. I mean, there's so many paper trails, right?
Wow. It's even hard to get your head around because I don't think of myself as very savvy. If I did want to cheat, I wouldn't even know what to do. I wouldn't know how to be savvy about cheating. I have no clue about anything when it comes to tech. So people who want to try to cover it up, even those people are usually, you're able to figure it out on a phone.
Yeah, I also think that whether it's the man or the woman who is cheating, right? Like it's not all like, oh, there's all these women that are being cheated on. There are women, 50% of people that are cheating are women, right? I also think that the women that are cheating, whoever it is that is cheating, there usually also is some degree of ambivalence, right? Where they might want their partner to find out because they want that person to wake up and realize, like, I've asked you to go on vacation. I've asked you to stop working on the weekends. I've asked you to, try salsa dancing with me, whatever, right? And that usually there is some unconscious intent of having the person kind of wake up. I don't think most people want to have a 7-9 year affair secretly. That isn't typically the norm.
Okay, so you find out, then how do you decide what to do? Should I stay? Should I go? Should we get help? How do we get help? Like, how do you even know how to take that next step?
Well, the first thing you're going to want to do is just Google couples therapist near me, right? You don't want to try to go through it alone because it can be so explosive and so painful. And the first stage, which again, I talk about Esther Perel a lot, but she talks about the first stage of learning of infidelity. Her term for it is death by 1,000 cuts. Because what the person is going through is that so say I learned today, oh, wow, Susie, you've been, having this affair for the last 2 years. I then suddenly start going through my photo album in my mind and saying, wow, Susie, that time we were out to dinner, and I thought we were working on things. Wow, you were in a relationship then. Or, oh, that time we went out for our anniversary. Wow, Susie, you were actually texting this other person. And you start replaying that health scare, that kid's graduation, that whatever, that all of a sudden everything is contaminated with this new knowledge of, like I was duped. I was in the dark. I was the fool, right? So that first stage is incredibly painful for the person that learns of the infidelity. And typically, understandably, that person then becomes pretty aggressive towards the cheater. So without outside support, it can just be very toxic and very messy and very volatile. So you really want to get someone to help you as soon as possible because you can create more damage.
Wow. And by the way, if you're just tuning in, I have been married 30 years this year.
Good for you.
Not Susie.
Let the record show.
Let the record show. Yeah. But I can't even imagine sorting out a problem like this without help. It seems impossible because the same patterns and you're furious.
Right.
So there's guilt and there's somebody incredibly angry and hurt. How do you even move that forward without help? It seems impossible.
Right. I think that's true. I think without help, you end up just stuck in this kind of like, I can't believe you were with this person, at the Super Bowl or on my birthday, and you can get very stuck in that death by 1,000 cuts stage and not move forward.
Wow. And also I'm just looking at you going, how do you do this for a living? Like, how do you manage all of this negativity and people who are upset? Like, you must be a superwoman as a therapist to be able to like get in there and stay the course and not bring it all home. It's a lot of negativity and hurt.
But it's also really great though, because I think the worst thing for any relationship is being on autopilot, right? Yeah. Where you're kind of half engaging and, kind of keeping your eye on the road, but really checking your texts and, like just kind of phoning it through in your relationship. And at least when there is the revelation of infidelity, things are real. People are honest. Like something is happening that will change things for the better, regardless of what the outcome is. Like things are honest.
I'm so glad you reframed that, but you're right. The reality of the situation is staring you in the face. There's no more fun and games with it. Like it's clear as day. And as a professional, as a psychologist, that of course that's exciting because you're really going to help somebody.
Yeah.
I was just sitting there thinking, oh my God, those first few appointments must just hope you don't have many the same day at that stage.
Good point.
My goodness. Okay. So then how do you start helping people who are in that really bad first phase?
Well, I think the first thing is to only have these kind of death by 1,000 cuts conversations on a limited basis, because the problem is, again, the person that is kind of reliving all of these memories wants to talk about it 24/7, which is completely understandable, but not helpful for either part. But typically in therapy, you can move through that phase within a couple weeks or so. And then the next phase is really trying to figure out, like, were the two of you on autopilot? Like, what was going on such that, something like this could happen? So really diving into what has your relationship been like? Like, was it great? Did it seem great? Like, what is the reality and when did things change? Because presumably things were better, at some earlier point.
And so in your experience, do people tend to look for an affair, or is it more a coincidence that one presents?
Well, tell me what you mean exactly.
Like, is somebody typically going, I need to have this kind of an emotional need met or sexual need met, period. I'm going to go make something happen. Or is it usually something that just happens where somebody's not looking for it, but it presents itself, an opportunity or an attraction presents?
Well, that is a good question, right? Like, remember the website Ashley Madison, which since went up in flames? Like, it was, I can't remember what their tagline was, but it was something really offensive. Like,
Yeah, it
you can
was.
be married and eat your cake too. I mean, I think there's a small proportion of people that are actively looking to sort of stray, but I think it typically happens more organically, right? Like where you meet someone and there's just a certain chemistry and a friendship. And maybe it starts out as sort of emotional infidelity, where this person is just sort of like a new best friend or work husband, work wife, right? And then it kind of, there's a work trip or an event where things kind of step over the line. I think that's way more often the case than someone saying, I'm hopping on Tinder and, right.
Interesting. So what do you think? Do people know off the bat what they want ultimately when they come in? It's like, oh, my husband strayed. I'm going to hire this person, but basically I know it's done. Or are they typically more open to the process of really discovering and determining what's still possible for them in their relationships?
That's a good question. I think there's a minority of people like myself where the infidelity sort of crystallized this gut feeling of like, oh, this is a toxic relationship, right? Like, I don't need to be here and this is all the proof I need. And I actually think that those people probably don't even go to therapy, right? Like they just call the divorce lawyer. They get the moving tape and the boxes and they're just done. I think that people that come to therapy are more open to possibility, right? They're hoping that maybe this represents something that they can work on. Maybe they feel guilt about their own infidelity, but they're open to really digging deep and trying to rebuild.
Okay. So once you get through that first phase of death by a thousand cuts, which I don't mean to laugh because it just sounds horrible. The way you described it is really, I can start to imagine what that must be like. And then you're kind of open and you're into that next phase of discovering what was really going on. What happens next?
Well, I think that once you really start to get honest about what was working and what wasn't working, and maybe what was going on for one particular member of the marriage, like, oh, well, I was dealing with a health condition, which made me more aware of my mortality, and I became impulsive and decided to sort of seize the moment in a way that's really uncharacteristic for me. I think there just tends to be a lot more insight and empathy for one another, which, kind of leads things to kind of repair in many ways. But I will say it's once you come into therapy, there is tremendous room for improvement and repair and growth and sort of enhanced honesty. But I've also seen couples come in where someone comes in and they just really aren't that remorseful, right? And they aren't that reflective and they aren't putting in the kind of sort of sincere repair or remorse or sort of dedication. And then that kind of speaks volumes about, where the couple's going to go.
Right when you said remorseful, I was going to ask about apologies and forgiveness. And how does that work in therapy? If somebody is really remorseful for breaking that vow and that commitment, and the other person is probably still angry. And we know that apologies and forgiveness, that must be a part of the process. How does that work?
Well, I think it's a really important part of the process, and it's not a one and done. It's repeatedly the person sort of having remorse and, reflection and really being open to the partner who was hurt, maybe kind of verbally attacking them and pulling up these incidents. And that person really has to be kind of made of iron and tolerate, like, yeah, I deserve this, right? Like, I hurt you. You have a right to be angry. And it's often in that process when the person who strayed is remorseful and kind and sincere that then it kind of diminishes the other person's rage. But, I've also seen people come in, men and women, who are not particularly remorseful. And then they really can stay stuck for quite some time. because they might say, hey, we've covered this, knock it off. Like, we've already talked about this. I can't keep having this conversation. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, yes, you can. Like, you absolutely can keep having this conversation if it helps your partner. But sometimes when people kind of wall off and say, we're done talking about this, that kind of really puts like a knife in terms of like how quickly things can move along.
Wow, Lauren, I'm glad that you mentioned that. I just had a thought that I definitely think that women, well, it's probably, I don't know, you can tell me how true this is, but I think women really have a need to talk. And
Absolutely.
I've seen men in my world over, I'm 60 now. I've seen a lot of men had relationships with men. I think it tends to be, I know it's a broad sweeping generalization. I know that, but I just noticed how quickly I thought it when you mentioned that. I think it can be easier to wall off with the frustration that you took care of. We talked about it already. I'm going to tick that box. Let's move on. What do you think? Am I making that up? Is that just a product of me watching sitcoms in the 70s?
No, I definitely think that that's very true. And I think in that instance, if a man, say you're in this sort of classic 1950s situation where the man has cheated and the woman is saying, I would like for you to be a little bit more sincere. And the man is saying, hey, I've been sincere. I checked that box. Most of the time, it comes from more of a sense of like practicality where they're not trying to be cold or unremorseful, but they genuinely have this kind of like, you do this, you do 1, you do 2, you do 3, like we already covered 1, 2, and 3. And so it comes from like a lack of insight, and they typically need a little bit more education around like, hey, buddy, like you are correct. We have had this conversation 2, 3, 4 times. But your wife maybe needs a little bit more softness in terms of helping her work through it.
And thank you for clarifying that. But I can also see there's plenty of women that feel like that too, and they just don't love talking as much. In my experience, the women, we like to talk. I just came back from a retreat, and one observation I had was how amazing it was for the women to have a chance to just talk and connect and do retreat-like things without any pressure of having to negotiate the kinds of things that a partner might want to do instead of the kinds of things that we were doing. There was a freedom, for example, to go get charms that were offered as a reason to get us into a jewelry store. But as women, we knew what was going on. We understood the marketing, but we just wanted to go get the charms. And I was thinking there was so much joy around getting the charms. And if that needed to be negotiated, just because men and women can be very different in terms of the way they want to spend time on a cruise. Yep. So I know it's a silly little example, but, and it does come from a broad sweeping generalization and the way we grew up, but definitely being older, being 50 plus, we did grow up a certain way in a society that was a certain way. And we all read that book, Men Are From whatever. Yeah. How'd that go?
Men Are From Mars.
That was it. So we kind of understand the way communication was explained in that book. Most of us read it. So I get that. So I think that's a beautiful role for you as a psychologist in a situation like that, because whoever is needing support to maybe talk about something again, if you didn't have help, it wouldn't happen.
Right.
It just wouldn't happen. You'd be closed down.
Right. And I think that's what happens. Like if you don't get the support and sort of the steering that is helpful, people, have the affair or the infidelity revealed, but then they get stuck in this very hostile place, right? And then they think, well, I have to get divorced because we're just so nasty to each other all the time. But the reality is like with some support and some steering, that is just a phase. Like it's part of the journey, but it's not the whole journey. And people move past that. But you do need like a referee at times.
That was such a great analogy, to be steered. And it makes so much sense. Like, why would you know how to do this when you didn't have the skills to avoid it in the first place? You know,
Yeah.
you need the help. And that makes so much sense. So in your experience, how likely is it that somebody's able to move past this?
The truth of the matter is I have a skewed sample because the people that stay in therapy are the ones that are really working on it. And some people come for a short amount of time and then they kind of drop out. And I don't know what happens for them. But I would say anecdotally of the people that really stick with it, I would say at least 3/4 really work on their relationship and get it back to like a much better place.
Wow, my eyebrows are raised. I know we're just on a podcast, but you can see it. I'm a little surprised by that. That is so hopeful.
Yeah. I think it's really not the end of the world, but it is something you have to take very seriously. The other person that I would love to quote is Dan Savage, who's an author, and he has an amazing podcast too, all about love and relationships. But the thing that he talks about is that say you're married for 30 years and say you strayed one time in 30 years. And he makes a similar argument, which is that American culture wants to say, it's broken, you screwed up, like you should be thrown out onto the street because you're a bad person. But his argument is like, listen, if it was only one time in 30 years, like you're actually pretty good at monogamy, right? Like, let's be a little bit more compassionate about human nature and impulsivity and a glass of wine or whatever. But that really, if you take more of a bird's eye view of marriage, particularly longer term marriages, this American culture of sort of like, once a cheater, always a cheater, it doesn't do anyone any favors.
You've really given such an interesting perspective. Like I said, I've never taken a deep dive into this topic, and I don't know many people personally who've even dealt with it or talked about it. Right.
Right.
And that point was an excellent point. With so much stigma and shame. But your perspective is so interesting, and having kind of an inside look on what support would be like from somebody like you in a situation like this and what the phases are. So interesting. I can really appreciate how difficult it is and how important your work is, and now how hopeful it can be. Do you think you're to the point now with as much experiences that you have that you can accurately predict
whether someone's going to stay together or get divorced?
Yeah.
Usually I can tell in the sense that if the person that strayed, like say in this situation, I cheated. If I go into couples therapy and I say, well, you started it, or you were a jerk, or you were never kind, or if I'm super defensive and kind of gaslighting and rude, prognosis negative, right?
Yeah.
So when couples come in and you can sort of tell that maybe they've, like my first marriage, like that it's just sort of a toxic relationship. And this is just the outgrowth of like it's sort of like the final chapter of a very bad match. You can kind of feel that in your bones. Like, wow, this has really been a rough relationship for, however many years. And then you can also tell in couples where they really are genuinely alarmed by what happened and they really have respect and love for one another, even amid this world of hurt and pain.
So interesting. I would imagine that your radar would be pretty good at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
I really would. I mean, that's the one thing we get from being older is we get to be wiser. We get to be wiser. You've had a ton of experience. Lauren, thank you so much. I want to ask you, how can people learn more from you? You have a free tool on your site. You want to tell us about that?
Yes. Well, my website is my name. It's laurennapolitano.com. If you go to my website, there is a free tool, which is, it's a 30-second tool to combat the inner critic that's in our minds. For all of us, that little nasty voice that say you have a conversation with an acquaintance at Starbucks, and then you get back in your car and you say, oh, how did I say that? That was so stupid. Oh my God, I just put my foot in my mouth, right? That's the inner critic that really causes us a lot of unnecessary suffering, I have a 30-second tool that really just kind of works at kind of batting back that voice so that you can just kind of, let things ride a little bit more easily.
Amazing. And also on Instagram, how do we find you?
Yes. Also, my name is Lauren Napolitano, PsyD, PSYD, which is my degree.
Excellent. Okay. We will have everything in the summary notes. Lauren, thank you so much. I'm known in my podcast world, my little podcast world where I just sit here and talk to myself and exciting guests, but I'm known for bringing an upbeat approach to difficult topics. And I was like, ooh, I don't know how upbeat this topic's going to be because what am I going to do with Lauren? But I was just so pleased that you were open to sharing your personal story and just giving us the perspective. So I know it's not a total downer, especially we ended on such a high note about what it takes to be hopeful and what it takes to really work through some of these difficult issues. So thank you so much for doing what you're doing in the world and really helping at such a deep level. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Susie.
Okay, that's it for this episode. I think you will likely agree that Lauren really helped provide perspective about infidelity and some solid advice for those going through it. I also loved when she made her point about optimism, that many couples are able to have increasingly honest and meaningful conversations after infidelity. Lauren was a great guest. As you know, this podcast is all about how to love your life again after 50. It's really all about coaching you to be more intentional and to incorporate mindfulness into your life as a regular practice. This is how you put yourself on your agenda. My focus as your midlife coach is to help you get unstuck, clear, and focused on your current values and priorities so that you don't have regrets. I can help you create the confidence, courage, and meaning that you are looking for. If you're ready to explore what coaching together might look like for you, you are invited to book your momentum call at www.womeninthemiddleacademy.com, and we will chat. And one more thing, if you're feeling stuck and want to take some fast action, you're also invited to get my new masterclass, Get Unstuck, Midlife Clarity Fast and Easy, where you can get clear about your next chapter priorities without spin, confusion, and overwhelm in less than an hour. Head over to www.midliferoadmap.com. And finally, for show notes and links, head over to www.susierosenstein.com and click the podcast tab and look for episode 378. You'll also see links there for my new show, Women in the Middle Entrepreneurs. Thanks so much for listening. It's time for you to put yourself first, one thought at a time. I'm Susie Rosenstein, and I'll talk to you next week.